I think there's definitely appetite for the most basic DeFi functions of borrowing against your Bitcoin, using it as collateral and getting dollars. Like that's a very simple, easy one that has clear product market fit and protocol market fit.
Welcome, Dan and Farmer Joe. I am so excited to have you both here, two like mega superstars in Bitcoin DeFi. Welcome to the Bitcoin Rails podcast.
Well, thanks for having us.
Yeah, I'm super excited to kind of dive in. I feel like we were sort of chatting a little bit about this off camera, but you two sort of have very different backgrounds in DeFi / Bitcoin DeFi and kind of came together to create this sort of ultimate Bitcoin DeFi venture fund. So I'm excited to dig a little bit into sort of each of your backgrounds of like how you got there, and then we can get into the good stuff, kind of chat about the past, present, and future of Bitcoin DeFi. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
All right, cool. So Dan, I mean, you were sort of one of the original Bitcoin DeFi voices. I mean, when did you even start to hear about this word Bitcoin DeFi? I mean, do you remember when this term was coined?
That's a great question. I mean, most of this is true, but I'm not sure about the exact dates. I'm not going to be like, oh, it was March 2020, exactly. But I remember writing some tweet storms on like how to earn yield on your Bitcoin.
Okay.
This is mainly like CeFi yield stuff. But then I found things like, managing Lightning channels and providing Lightning channel liquidity. You could earn yield.
When was this about?
About 2020-ish.
Okay.
And then also things like coin joins, like if you use Join Market.
Okay.
Join Market, you can do coin joins. And if you provide liquidity for a coin join, you can earn yield doing that.
Okay.
Which is actually an early like DeFi primitive of Bitcoin where you're earning yield for liquidity.
But it actually makes sense. You're actually earning yield for something real, for an actual service.
Yeah, this isn't incentive yield, which most yield is incentive yield, where it's just
nowadays,
yeah. So that was kind of my early foray into it, where I'm like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like Bitcoin actually had some DeFi stuff. I mean, very primitive and small.
It was coin joins and Lightning at that point, basically.
At that point, yeah, that's right. And then started to read up on like side chains like Liquid, Rootstock. Saw that there were some interesting things going on there. And so that kind of began my foray into other things like looking at stacks. And so from there, I was still working at Kraken at the time. So I was at Kraken leading marketing from 2019 through 2022. And so I've been writing this up from 2020 through 2022 and just my tweets and tweet storms. And then decided to leave Kraken in July of 2022. And with TechCrunch, I kind of synthesized my departure of why I'm leaving and what I wanted to go do next, where I called out Bitcoin DeFi being, I think, the next big opportunity in crypto.
And Stacks, TrustMachines specifically, was that opportunity in your particular case?
Well, I haven't got anywhere full-time other than Asymmetrics since leaving Kraken. So I've just been a marketing advisor to TrustMachines, Taproot Wizards, Mezzo, and Starknet. Okay. So in those roles, just providing the marketing and advisory work on like brand positioning, social media strategy, et cetera.
All of those are relatively new. I like to think of it as like, pre-Ordinals. There's like Bitcoin DeFi season 1.
Totally.
And then Bitcoin season 2 DeFi.
Yeah.
Stacks was really the one that was season 1.
Totally. Stacks was like the only thing. It was like Rootstock and Stacks and Liquid, but no one uses Liquid. Well, no one uses Rootstock, and some people use Stacks, but not a ton. And so, yeah, it was Muneeb, I think, is a really incredible character in this story of pushing Bitcoin DeFi forward. I love his demeanor. His public demeanor is perfect for it. It's kind of that professor dad sort of vibe, which he got a lot of criticism for Bitcoin DeFi and Stacks for a long time, and he just handles it perfectly. Always kind of even keel, mild mannered. And so when he approached me with TrustMachines was kind of like the consensus, the Ethereum consensus for Ethereum. This would be like the same thing for Bitcoin.
Right.
And I was like, that's a really cool concept of you can go build dApps. And they wanted to build dApps on all Bitcoin layers, not just Stacks. And so he was like, hey, would you help advise us on our marketing strategy? And I'm like, yeah, that sounds super fun. But if you look into the original job description that we wrote up, again, it wasn't a full-time role. It was just a part-time role, but we actually call out like moving Bitcoin DeFi forward, moving the Overton window around that. So I think we did that. I think we actually kind of accomplished that to some degree. So that was, there was very few of us, and Aubrey Strobel joined as well. So her and I were kind of the only, her and I and Muneeb were some of the few voices in 2022.
We were like the front-facing folks in the Stacks ecosystem at that time.
Yeah, Stacks ecosystem. We were talking about Bitcoin DeFi. I remember when Ordinals first came about in early 2023, It was me and Danny from, I forget the Ordinals project, but we were at South by Southwest and talking about Bitcoin DeFi.
Wow.
Um, and so yeah, that's kind of the origins of 2022 has really shifted in my career to focus on Bitcoin DeFi, and that's how I got involved in it.
We're going to double click on the article that you wrote in 2022, the TechCrunch article. And I think that that's sort of like a good kind of historical moment thinking about, where Bitcoin DeFi maybe started and sort of how it's evolved since then. Before we do that, though, I mean, so you're sort of the other half of the asymmetric duo. And I'm kind of curious to learn about how the sort of Bitcoin venture fund really came together. I know this was sort of your baby, and then you brought on this other half. And also, you're the creator of PUPS Token. I'm so honored that the creator of PUPS Token is on my podcast.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your pre-Ordinals background and sort of how you came into Ordinals, because I think that's something most folks don't know about you.
Yeah, for sure. So, for me, Web3, I kind of was exposed to it in like 2017, December or so. So kind of felt the bloodbath about a month after, doing something in Web3, which is buying Bitcoin and buying some Ethereum at the time. But have just been like following everything that's been kind of going on from like the on-chain ecosystem development side of things. So I had a few colleagues that were in the Ethereum ICO, and they were very kind of early into DeFi as a construct on Ethereum in general. So I didn't really do anything on chain up until December of 2020. So I would have been like post DeFi summer, post all the AMM, Uniswap, Sushi Swap.
That's when you got deep, was DeFi summer. DeFi summer was like a turning point for you.
Well, I think I kind of missed the boat by about 3 months, but was just very curious as to what DeFi really means.
Good question.
Yeah. And honestly, I think for the first like 3 months, I didn't really understand it because, I was one that I'm like, well, we're just building value on top of the value of these tokens on the L1. And, is that a sustainable business model? I don't really know how I feel about that, but it was something really innovative on chain. And for me, my background prior to that was traditional finance. So, the AMM stuff and earning, I guess, yield on providing liquidity and becoming an automated market maker and an LP on chain just felt very intuitive for me. And I think that's really what kind of caught my interest. Ethereum was becoming a very expensive chain to use. And at the time, the problems and the struggles were that, no one really wanted to pay $80 to $120 for a swap fee, especially if you're starting out. And so, I was exposed to some of the first Ethereum L2s, which was Polygon. And for me, it just made a lot of sense. I'm like, well, these are penny transactions. This feels like a great place to start to build DeFi in a very cheap way. And
was Polygon kind of like your first like real success in DeFi kind of thing? Like, is that where you kind of
I don't know if I would even
wins?
call it really a success story, but it was like an
You got
nascent
deep in there.
ecosystem that, I was just exploring, borrowing, lending, swapping, liquidity providing. And this was basically as the scaling boom or the ecosystem boom of Ethereum was just starting to form. And, I think I was just noticing some of the alt L1s that were claiming performance and cheaper fees. And for me, I guess from someone who was playing around on some of these cheaper, scalable ecosystems, I was just kind of hopping around chains and seeing what apps were forming on them. And I think it was pretty consistent as to what the pillars of DeFi really were, which is, a borrow and lending platform, a swap platform, as well as a stablecoin. If you have those 3 pillars of DeFi, you have a viable ecosystem. And, I just basically had fun in the, I would say, 2021 and 2022 speculative bubble, which kind of led me to Bitcoin with Ordinals. I was never really like an NFT trader or anything like that, but I viewed this, DA layer of Bitcoin or bringing assets to Bitcoin as, the first pillar of an ecosystem forming, which kind of got me here.
You mentioned off camera before, you were saying that sort of part of your strategy in sort of a pre-Ordinals universe was also sort of getting in an ecosystem way, but when they were young, while they were young, because there's room to grow. Was that sort of a big motivating factor in coming into Ordinals? I mean, you were in Ordinals pretty early, is my understanding.
I was basically there like sub 1K inscriptions, and this was back in the time where you're minting these NFTs by sending Ethereum, funny enough, to
Like
some of these
Emblem Vault?
founders.
Is that like is that what you're referencing?
No, not even that. But there was just these Discord groups where they were minting these early inscriptions, and you had the option of sending BTC or sending
Because it was
Ethereum.
all OTC.
It was all
just
OTC.
like OTC buy your sub 1Ks. Yeah. Wow.
But again, I wasn't an NFT trader at all. For me, it was like the bigger picture. And I think, maybe 2 or 3 weeks after Ordinals came out, I'm like, well, we're going to have like a DeFi era boom on Bitcoin because we're going to have wallets that are going to support this. We're going to have infrastructure that is going to be starting to build out. And, I was crossing my fingers. I'm like, well, we'll probably have tokens on Bitcoin as well, because I think that would be pretty important.
You thought that was a logical next step, because I don't think everyone necessarily thought that, right? I mean, Ordinals didn't necessarily inherently lend themselves to token creation. I didn't see that coming until one day it happened with BRC20. I mean, did you have a feeling did that seem like a logical conclusion to you?
I think it was. I mean, I was just hoping that the pillars of DeFi, swaps, borrow and lending, and stablecoins would come to Bitcoin at the L1. I think my views have shifted pretty dramatically, just seeing everything play out.
We'll get into it. Okay.
But, 10-minute block times aren't, I would say the best for specific use cases, but I still think it's important that, we're positioning ourselves for an ecosystem of some sort to form on the L1.
Okay, so Ordinals happens. You kind of have this aha moment about Bitcoin after being mostly in the non-Bitcoin ecosystem world and DeFi for a long time. When Ordinals came up for you, I mean, you pretty quickly got the memo and quickly were like allied with Udi and Eric and joined Taproot Wizards. I mean, what was your point of view about what would come of Ordinals in the early days?
So, and I'm well known as a pretty big maxi, and I've spent the last 3 to 4 years trying to, first of all, I still love Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin's the most important thing in crypto, obviously, and that's why we're on this pod. That's why I created a fund to invest in this category. But I'd gone to NFT NYC. I had gone to ETH Denver, Solana Breakpoint, just to see what had happened in this DeFi world. Now, this is 2022, so it's a little bit on the end of the last bull run. But seeing how people kind of processed what went right, what went wrong, does throwing yield at people, like incentive yield, work? And so I spent a bunch of time kind of decompiling what had gone down with DeFi. And for me, NFTs were a very clear new asset type, where like it's a unique type of asset. It's not competing with money. It purely is subjective value, which all art is. So from a very basic primitive art use case, this was a unique asset type that found clear product market fit or protocol market fit over on Ethereum. And so, Ethereum NFTs had a few flaws to them where, one, a lot of them aren't on chain. They point to an IPFS file. It doesn't really kind of fit that true decentralization ethos. And when Ordinals came out and people were inscribing images, it very quickly to me kind of represented a more pure play NFT. You also to inscribe them is costly, which is very much Bitcoin's ethos of proof of work. So it felt like a NFT 2.0 that had all the characteristics of what NFTs should be. Regarding Taproot Wizards, I actually contributed to the original, the R Bitcoin ad. So on the subreddit. So the wizard meme is the wizard that says, "Come join us," and it says magic and internet money.
Right.
So that's an advertisement for the R Bitcoin.
From back in the day, right?
That's right.
Okay.
For the R Bitcoin subreddit. And so the subreddit we all contributed Bitcoin in to buy ad space on the other subreddits to point them to the Bitcoin subreddit saying, "Come join us, come check it out."
You and who else was part of this effort?
Thousands of other people.
Oh, wow. When was this? This was
2013, 2014.
Oh, man.
So
okay.
I fondly remembered that meme. And I love the meme because it's just so retarded looking. Like it's like this ridiculous looking wizard drawn in like MS Paint. It looks atrocious, but fun atrocious. Like,
the MS Paint thing. Well, and Far, I remember like the first time I had to download that Far was a serious artist. He was like, yes, I had to give myself the artistic creative constraint of making this image in MS Paint because that was the original, the art history was MS Paint.
People forget that Far went to Harvard.
Far's a genius.
I don't know if you knew that, but
I had no idea.
Far is a genius.
Yeah, Far is a genius.
True artist. Yeah, true digital artist.
And you can see that art with the Wizards collection.
100%.
And so For me, Udi and Eric, I've known them for a long time. I found them to kind of be part of like the Bitcoin moderates, not the hardcore maxis, a little bit more open-minded. I also loved how Udi and Eric troll both Ethereum and Bitcoin maxis.
You identify with this.
Yeah, I identify with that. I like their vibe. They're genius.
We all do now. Yeah.
They're genius social media marketers. Like absolutely genius.
100%. Udi's a genius.
And so when
makes your job easy.
It actually does a little bit. Yeah, I'm not gonna claim I'm the genius behind Taproot Wizards marketing because it's honestly Udi and Eric, but I do play a part in that. But I'm not gonna. Yeah, these guys are brilliant. I have no comments on their social strategy. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But for the Wizards collection, I actually reached out to Udi and I was like, I want to get involved. I think this collection is going to be the most iconic NFT collection across all chains.
Wow. Interesting. So, because of the four-megger? Like, why did you think that?
Not the four-megger. I just think vibes.
Like he's just bringing the heat.
The Wizards energy was perfect. I was like, this just feels mimetically like just such a potent mimetic package. It also resonated with me because it was the meme. I remember the original meme. And it's just fun, playful, indifferent, magical, some might say. So I actually, worked for Wizards before they raised money.
You were before they raised money. Yeah. And you're still a team member of sorts. I mean,
almost 2 years now. So yeah, for them, I'm technically the head of marketing, which was just me.
Yeah.
And like I said, their social strategy is brilliant, but all the parties that they do, I plan all those.
So at what point did this concept of sort of Bitcoin DeFi really start to come about? Actually, it might be a better place to start is how did you two start chatting with each other and start thinking about developing this like broader Bitcoin DeFi strategy?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Yeah, I think, after probably summer of 2023, we were introduced by another builder, Robert Clark, who now has Satflow.
How did you meet Robert Clark?
Through FarmerJoe.
Yeah, I think it just kind of came through passing because Robert and I were talking from like month 2 of Ordinals. Obviously, he created a really unique minting experience for the Bitcoin punks.
Yeah.
And when I first saw that, front end application, I was just like, wow, like whoever built this is a very talented developer. Clearly, they know what they're doing. And thereafter, he was leveraging Emblem Vault to build this OpenSea of Ethereum for Ordinals, using wrapped Ordinals themselves for trading.
Counterparty wrapped, essentially, right?
Effectively the same thing. And to me, I'm just like, wow, like the fact that they spun this up in like a month, I'm like, I got to talk to this guy a little bit more because he's worth betting on.
He's on top of it. Yeah,
he's on top of it. And so this was kind of at the time where I was kind of forming my own thesis. I talked about like the pillars of DeFi. And so, I backed Xverse as an angel. I backed Liquidium as like the borrow and lending platform, backed Saturn, which is building the first DEX AMM of
That's
Bitcoin.
An Arch Network play, right?
It is now, but originally it was just trying to be a trading platform. So it wasn't aiming to be an AMM, but they were just trying to be a fungibles marketplace.
Had you angel invested before that point, or was this the first ecosystem?
It was really like the first foray of angel investing. I mean, I made maybe 1 or 2 angel investments prior to 2023, but it wasn't until, I would say like the financial success of trading NFTs that, is again, just doubling down on this being an ecosystem and owning kind of the critical pillars of, the L1 story, to me felt like a worthwhile bet to take. And I was just obsessed with, trying to, I would say like move the needle forward with some of these teams. So, I think I'm still one of the most involved angels in Xverse, in Saturn, even in Liquidium in some of the earliest days. And so it just made sense. It just, it was a passion, I guess, filling up the ecosystem with things to do became almost like a passion project, and it was just keep rotating into backing some of the best teams, and that's kind of how we really got in touch. And Dan's obviously been
on deals together before Asymmetric happened, basically.
Yeah, that's right. We both were cutting angel checks into the category, and there weren't a ton of deals back in the day, so
right.
We naturally kind of ended up on the same cap tables. I think I was following FarmerJoe on Twitter. because he had some good alpha.
Great
Yeah, he had great alpha. So
Yeah, that's how I remember learning who you were, was like, oh, you got to follow this Ordinals trader,
Yeah.
like
I
that
mean,
was
look, I had no CT experience other than just lurking pre 2023.
mm,
So, to me, it was like, oh, I'm at 1K followers. Oh, I'm at 10K followers. Oh, suddenly I'm at 25K followers. And
you picked the right niche and you had the right information.
So yeah, we
So,
started sharing deal flow, started to evaluate deals together. So kind of naturally, a very organic process of, the primary functions of venture capital are deal flow, so sourcing new deals and then evaluating them, and we were already kind of doing that.
so
And so yeah, kind of the asymmetric story, how that all comes together is that I started Asymmetric Bitcoin DeFi Venture Fund, which is a fund within the firm called Asymmetric.
great.
Asymmetric was started by Joe McCann.
Okay.
So he's the managing partner, and then him and I were the co-GPs of Asymmetric Bitcoin DeFi Venture Fund.
And the mission of this is Bitcoin DeFi only.
Bitcoin DeFi Venture early stage.
Okay.
So we're not buying tokens on the open market. We're not investing in equity plays. Like we're not doing like an exchange or a wallet. Like they would need to be a protocol. So
Right.
Joe was a great fit. He was Joe's a very counterculture sort of guy. He's was very big Solana and meme coins early,
Okay.
before it was popular at all. I mean, he was calling this for years. So he's willing to be contrarian for a very long time, and that's someone I see as a really good fit
Mm.
for this fund, because Bitcoin DeFi was not a popular category. I mean, hated by the maxis, the Bitcoin maxis, and hated by crypto. We're in this like weird spot to where we weren't really accepted by a lot of folks. So Asymmetric was kind of the perfect sort of spot for this DeFi venture fund. And it was a lot of work because Joe McCann is running his side of the business, and I was running the Bitcoin DeFi venture fund, raising and deploying at the same time, which last year we looked at 200 deals together.
Wow.
So some of that I was on my own, but then pretty quickly, after about 3-4 months, Joe and FarmerJoe and I had been, staying in touch, obviously. And I was, we're still evaluating deals together. And I'm like, well, do you want to come join Asymmetric and, let's do it together again? Which, we were already doing that in an angel capacity. So honestly, it was one of the easiest sort of job offers I've ever given, where I was like, well, do you want to do what we all do already?
You're like,
Yeah.
this is an obvious thing to do.
I really think it's like nothing really changed. It almost felt like I was working with Dan for like a 6-month period beforehand. So
That's perfect.
it's really in the same capacity.
And you said when you say protocol only, does that mean that you basically, it's all like tokens essentially? Like you
That's right.
require that projects have their own tokens?
Yeah, well, one, we think that, of course, we don't like staple on tokens. Like we don't want to see a project where they just stapled a token on there, which a lot of the deals we've looked at, people just like staple it on, and we're like, that doesn't really make much sense. For L2s, I don't know how an L2 would accrue value other than through a token. Same with like
Hot take, but yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's our fun thesis. So
Is that?
well, yeah, that's why we invest in protocols and tokens, because we believe that value accrual will be primarily through tokens.
What do you think about, there's a very small number of them, but a couple of L2s out there that are like, no, you don't need a token. You can just like use Bitcoin and you like upfront the liquidity into this whatever incentive node operator situation. Do you call bluff on that?
So by the way, we have great relationships with pretty much every L2 in the category. The ones that have mentioned, I'm not going to mention them by name because
I won't either.
We both know who we're talking about.
Yeah.
So a year ago, there was about 3 or 4 of them that said that, and we're seeing conversations now where a few of them are rethinking.
They're folding.
Yes, which I don't exactly like that either, because if you're just changing because your VCs or the market's changing, and that's why you're changing, it feels a little weird versus like if you felt like, having a token from the get-go made sense. Like if you didn't like tokens before and now you're changing your tune for reasons that aren't because you fundamentally care that much, like you're doing it because the market's doing it. That sort of pivot I'm not exactly a fan of. But yeah, there's a handful, and I respect that though. I respect their building process of not using a token. We hypothesize as VCs like that Bitcoin DeFi will be a thing, and that value accrual will happen to the tokens. And that's what we're making a bet with here. So, I like to see all builders in the Bitcoin DeFi category, regardless of if they use a token or not. I'd love to see all of them succeed. So for us, where it's not investable for us, but I'd like to see them succeed too.
Where do you see these tokens, like, how do you see these tokens actually being built and like how that plays out? Like, are they going to be Bitcoin, or most of these companies thinking about Bitcoin native tokens? Are they like inventing their own tokens? Are they, I mean, I've heard, Bitcoin companies that are going to, put their tokens on Solana because that's where the liquidity is. Like, how are the builders you're talking to mostly thinking about this question?
I think that's a really good question. I think, natively or inherently, you do kind of want to launch a token on the chain that you're originated from.
You would think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think we're starting to see a bit of a shift where, you can have a token on the chain that you're built on, what, down the line will accrue value of some sort natively from the chain that your product is built on. But similarly, like we see like the Pudgy Penguin story where they're an Ethereum-based NFT, but they ended up launching on Solana because that's where the liquidity, the users, the fast throughput really is. And so, I don't think it's starting to, I would say like, it doesn't really matter, or it's starting to not really matter where you're launching your token. You're starting to see where you launch a token as almost launching your token on a decentralized exchange or a centralized exchange alternative. And so if the whole point of a token is to make it tradable, it does need to be where people are actively trading it. And so, for Pudgy Penguins, it made sense that most of the trading activity around meme coins were definitely on Solana. And so if you're starting a meme coin, you might as well, launch it on Solana. I think, more seriously though, when you're dealing with utility tokens, it starts to be a little bit more tricky because we don't necessarily have, or at least anytime you're launching a token on another chain, there is wrapped, bridge risk and so forth. So some teams might not want to do that initially, but I think these are problems that are worth funding and worth solving to then enable, maybe these teams launching a token that accrues value on Bitcoin L1 or maybe some of these L2s that is wrapped, bridged, through things like Wormhole, across, you name it, on other chains to become tradable and then, go to centralized exchanges as a distribution platform.
I mean, it makes sense to me that you would want to launch a token where there's liquidity. I mean, I think we've all seen in the Bitcoin native asset space, especially recently, that, liquidity is a major issue that anyone launching a token needs to be aware of. I'm curious, Dan, if you think, though, it's problematic from a branding perspective.
Well, someone asked me this question earlier of like, what is Bitcoin DeFi? It was actually Gabe on the
Galaxy.
Yeah, from Galaxy. We had a panel with Rena, Gabe, and I at the conference 2 days ago, and so Gabe was like, "Well, how do you define Bitcoin DeFi?"
Great question.
And I think that somewhat flows into this a bit, and I'm very permissive with it, where I think there's some gatekeeping that can occur. Where like, what's a Bitcoin L2, right? Where people are like, "Well, a Bitcoin L2 represents this, this, and this," to where like there's only really maybe one L2 that fits that parameter. So I consider that a little too gatekeepy, where like, what is DeFi? I mean, I think DeFi is anything that touches Bitcoin in any sort of fashion, right? So like, because people are like, well, if you take a bridged Bitcoin and use it on an L2, like, is that Bitcoin DeFi? Because that L2 could be anything. It could be an L2 or it could be another L1.
A non-Bitcoin L2,
Yeah,
God forbid.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And so you bridge Bitcoin and put it on anything, right? So I consider that activity to be Bitcoin DeFi as well, because it's using Bitcoin in a DeFi-esque activity. That's a bridged Bitcoin. So for me, I'm quite permissive with the language of like, if people are, if so they have a governance token and that's issued on another chain, but this is connected to Bitcoin DeFi, I think that's fine. For me, as long as this value ultimately is touching Bitcoin in some sort of fashion.
So you'll make investments in companies that are sort of multi-chain as long as they have like a core Bitcoin thesis attached.
It's got to be a really strong core Bitcoin thesis. Okay. Like, of course, there's some that like we haven't really invested in any sort of interoperability protocols.
Okay.
I think that would be a little bit too kind of multi-chain for us. Yeah. But certainly if they touch other chains, it's not an issue.
So, I mean, this is sort of like a perfect segue, and I want to get back into sort of like the history of Bitcoin DeFi, but this is the perfect opportunity to talk about just sort of Bitcoin native tokens in general. How important do you think Bitcoin native tokens and the advent of Bitcoin native tokens, specifically BRC20, Ruins, et cetera, are for Bitcoin DeFi? I mean, maybe this is kind of leading into your broader question, what is Bitcoin DeFi? But is that critical? Are Bitcoin native assets critical to the progression of Bitcoin DeFi, in your opinion?
I really think that like if we just view blockchains as countries, it's a really, good parallel. So, Ethereum is as a country, Bitcoin is a country. And so in a country, you have to have assets of value being created in a digital way. Otherwise all we have is, Ethereum, Bitcoin, Solana as blockchains, as valuable tokens, and everything else is just, speculative instruments, I would say, right? So I think that's fine, but there has to be a means of bringing value in a tokenized way into these countries. And so if you don't have the ability or means to create any value on chain, then you don't have things like ordinals, you don't have things like BRC20, you don't have things like runes, and maybe even some future token standards that may make more sense to be issued on Bitcoin. So if that's all you have, then Bitcoin as a country is just, a store of value. And that's not really an ecosystem. So I think tokens and data on chain, enables creators to create value and instruments of value, be it speculative, utility, protocols, and so forth, that then are valuable in a digital world. And I think that's a critical element of ownership if we're thinking about Web3 in the context of digital ownership.
In that universe, how important is bridging Bitcoin native assets? I mean, you mentioned 10-minute block times being a significant limitation in Bitcoin DeFi and for Bitcoin native assets. How do you deal with that? I mean, how do you imagine that will be dealt with in the future?
I think that's the golden question here, is just like, how do we scale Bitcoin? Up until, I guess, Bitcoin season 2, which is what I think we're in right now, there's been, I would say, some ways to think about scaling Bitcoin, but it's been primarily focused on using Bitcoin as a payments mechanism. Lightning was the original way to think about scaling Bitcoin. And most of the maxis, I would say, don't really believe in creating digital value. They view these as, shitcoins, really.
It's just money and that's it.
And it's just money at the end of the day. And I think we're finally at the stage where, a lot of people are embracing this what if scenario. And Bitcoin is a $2 trillion, asset class, and addressable TAM is, many multiples of that. And so I wouldn't necessarily say the only use case of Bitcoin should be digital money. It should be, an ecosystem. It should be, a chain that then allows scalability to, tap into its inherent security. And I think that's really where we're going, right?
Well, and that I think has probably been like the challenge, is that there hasn't really been a particularly trust minimized way to do these activities in the past.
And there's something I want to add to this as well. Yeah. Like the Bitcoiners with this payments ideology, which, by the way, no one wants to use their Bitcoin for payments. Like,
no one wants to buy coffee with Bitcoin.
No, it's this kind of crazy, I don't know, hobby sort of thing that they want to shove down people's throats. And I'm like, how about we just listen to the market and see how people are using it? I mean, color me crazy for considering that, but that's basically, if you look at how people use Bitcoin, it's more store of value, a speculative store of value. Their obsession with this circular economy narrative, they were missing a key component, which they were looking at the physical circular economy rather than the digital one. And with native Bitcoin assets, that unlocked that digital circular economy for the first time. Spending the last 3 years going to like Solana, Breakpoint, ETH, Denver, and kind of seeing how these ecosystems blossomed, this DeFi ecosystem blossom on ETH. It's because, for example, like with NFTs, you've got artist types who aren't normally attracted to crypto at all. In fact, I actually met a woman last night who told me that she got into Bitcoin because of ordinals. And so this goes to the point of NFTs with Ethereum. I was at NFT NYC. And these artists were like, yeah, so I bought this JPEG for 0.1 ETH and flipped it for 0.3. And then I'm like, oh shit, it kind of like really clicked for me where I'm like, they're thinking in an Ethereum standard because they're trading these other assets. And
because they're NFT maxis, basically.
Right, exactly. So these tokens really represent more of like whatever speculative activities one wants to do. If you like to trade meme coins, if you like to trade NFTs, it's sort of like, which casino games do you like? So, Bitcoin's primary method of adoption throughout its entire existence has been spot speculation. Tons of speculation, right? Like
trading. People
come for the speculation, they stay for the sound money. If everyone understood sound money, then we wouldn't see any blow off tops in the cycles because everyone would get it. and continue to invest, but instead they just crowded in and bought Bitcoin because their buddy told them to buy it, and then they were just trying to try to make a quick buck. So speculation was the core driver of Bitcoin adoption throughout its entire existence. Like, for example, a lot of people point to the Silk Road as like, oh, well, that's an example of how payments push Bitcoin forward. It's false, because Silk Road got shut down 2 months before the 2013 bull run. So it didn't contribute at all to that bull run.
Oh,
And in fact,
interesting.
Bitcoin, it went from 100 to 1200, 12x'd
Right.
after Silk Road.
It's really de minimis. Yeah.
Yeah, it's de minimis, exactly. So speculation is the core driver of adoption. And seeing this on ETH, I'm like, wow, they have multiple games to play instead of just spot trading. You have yield farming, lending, borrowing, staking, and those appeal to different people. And at the end of the day, whether they're trading in and out of these different tokens, and eventually they end up with ETH in their pocket, though, and they start to think in an ETH standard.
Well, and the market has been very clear, as you've clearly pointed out. I think this is an important key thing, that the digital circular economy is wildly more successful than the
Absolutely.
physical digital economy that's sort of been attempted to be created.
It's a bigger market. It's a global market.
Yeah,
Right? It's a
even
global
El
market.
Salvador, even legal tender couldn't do it. You know what I mean? I mean, where is this going? So I'm curious, though, we kind of touched on this idea of like trust assumptions and how historically you haven't been able to do all of these, like play these DeFi games in a trustful way, right? I mean, I think arguably a lot of the maxi argument of why they don't get involved in DeFi activities is because all the solutions are custodial, right? I mean, up until recently now, we're starting to edge into this universe where maybe that's going to change. Do you think that maxis even might participate in things like lending, for instance, if you could do it in a trustless way?
I'll take a quick stab at this and then love to hear Farmer Joe's thoughts. When you look at, so this is a key question that our LPs asked, because I talked to quite a few to go raise the money we did for the fund. And they were like, do Bitcoiners want to do these things? So in our research, we found that 87% of Bitcoin owners hold another crypto asset.
87%? Wow.
Well, remember the meme on Twitter, 13%, where the Bitcoin maxis had 13% in their name on Twitter?
I mean, it makes sense.
That's where that comes from, because they're like the 13%.
Minimal, they're a very small community,
Totally.
minority. Yeah.
A very small minority. And so, yeah, most Bitcoiners own another crypto asset. And so the idea of people are like, well, okay, sure, maybe they do that, but maybe they don't. They use Bitcoin as their savings account and they don't want to touch that. I'm like, cool, even if we assume that to be true, they still might want to borrow against their Bitcoin using it as collateral.
I want to take out a mortgage against my Bitcoin. I don't want to sell my Bitcoin to buy a house. Like, that sounds like a really bad idea, bad trade.
And I mean, I'm a 12-year hodler. Like, you can either sell, borrow against it, or lend it.
Right.
Each one has its own risk. Like selling spot, you live with regret. Borrow against it, your interest rate's high and you can get margin called.
Exactly.
And then
And you have custody risk up until recently, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So DeFi, I think there's definitely appetite for the most basic DeFi functions of borrowing against your Bitcoin, using it as collateral and getting dollars. Like, that's a very simple, easy one that has clear product market fit and protocol market fit. So yeah, I think from a minimal viable dApp perspective, like that alone would be a hugely successful dApp. But yeah, I'm curious to hear what Farmer has to say.
Yeah, I think we're entering an era where Ethereum, over the last few years, if you weren't an active user of this, incentive musical chairs game that was promoted all across Ethereum, if you didn't play the musical chairs game, you had your Ethereum value, staked Ethereum, 8%, 4% yield or whatever it was at $4,000 Ethereum, absolutely get eroded to 2,200 today or so. And so, I think DeFi simply just makes sense with a better base asset. And we're entering this point where, look, it's almost like in the real world, for example, the value of your dollar decays if you don't, play with it in some way in the ecosystem to keep compounding it. And Ethereum basically eroded half of its value because, if you weren't playing within the ecosystem, the value that you were, holding with just staking it was getting eroded by decay. And I think that's like why Bitcoin DeFi makes more sense, and maybe why building DeFi, activity or the circular economy in the digital realm makes a lot more sense with Bitcoin as a sound money, because, it's not going to get eroded. There isn't necessarily this philosophy or this culture to play yield games or these, musical chairs.
Yeah, and to Farmer Joe's point, I mean, within an inflation rate, like a staking yield rate, you have your money is eroded if you don't participate, which we're going back to the existing fiat economy all over again, right? Like with inflation in my bank account, I got to go shove my dollars into money markets. Like I can't just hold it, which is what money should be. I mean, gold, the quintessential form of money, is that. You don't have to worry about it being diluted. Well, I'm sure people find more gold, but there's no government inflationary mechanic that erodes the value of gold. So yeah, with Bitcoin, I think it's that sound base for a new financial system or a DeFi ecosystem. There were some early plays on this, like Tony from Atomic Finance. They were some of the earliest folks to talk about this. Also, back in 2020, I met them, and they were building. You could sell covered calls using DLCs, which is pretty cool.
DLCs are so cool.
I know. I think these DLCs are awesome. Atomic Finance.
And early. They're season 1 technology and so cool and underrated in my opinion. But yeah, continue.
They've never said this, but I think it's, one of the first instances of CDeFi actually, because the way that they were generating this yield was coming from centralized exchanges, where they were executing some of these delta neutral trading strategies or covered call strategies, but paying back to the DLC itself on native Bitcoin.
So I had Rena Shaw on the show earlier this morning, and she had sort of like a take. I was asking her kind of like, okay, so what do you see as like the broad, what does Bitcoin DeFi look like in the future? And what are the implications of that for broader crypto DeFi? Does crypto DeFi just collapse onto Bitcoin in this universe? Like, what does the world look like in terms of decentralized finance? And her take was basically that you're going to have real basic like lending, staking, kind of like those sort of more classical forms of like kind of like TradFi-esque almost use cases on Bitcoin. And then you'll have these like kind of like weird, more sophisticated, like nerdy things happening on other chains. Thoughts?
I really think that why not bring it all to Bitcoin or a scaling solution of Bitcoin or a general purpose blockchain on top of Bitcoin?
So you think the whole world collapses onto Bitcoin? Ultimately, eventually, low time preference.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're getting into a realm right now where the narrative or the hot and sexy thing to do right now is to build a performant, general purpose blockchain. Solana is kind of like the first instance of building that real time blockchain. Now we have the experiment that is Mega ETH and the experiment that is Monad, but these are just separate L1s and fundamentally, I think that they have a flaw that they inherit by caring about the L1 token as the pillar of their ecosystem in DeFi, rather than, maybe some of these Bitcoin L2 scaling solutions, which will really have a culture around, sound money.
And if you go back to the original sort of like Bitcoin maxi cohort, so the recent maxis that we see are all post 2020. Read the Bitcoin Standard, conflate Bitcoin with eating meat and being a family man and stuff like that, which have nothing to do with each other. So the moralization of money only occurred after Saifedean entered the space. I think his presence is extremely negative.
After who? Sorry.
Saifedean.
Oh, Saifedean.
From a cultural standpoint, because it led to this like very, very just not culturally coherent at all compared to early Bitcoin maxi ideology.
Was Saifedean bringing the sort of like, hyper masculine red meat eating culture?
Exactly.
Was that him? Really?
It was him, the Bitcoin Standard, that fiat had eroded cultural and
moral integrity, basically.
Exactly. And so he moralized this whole thing, which was ridiculous. I mean, the early Bitcoin values are very libertarian. 3D printed guns, drugs, and extremely permissive stuff. They're fine with like, you can.
And they'll claim that they're still that way, even though there's clear hypocrisy happening. I mean, my personal aha moment was ocean mining, but we can get into that later.
Yeah, I mean, that's why they hate on NFTs, because they consider them to be morally corrupt. But I'm like, how can you be libertarian and a free markets enthusiast and try to moralize someone's subjective value of art? Like, I think someone has very poor taste buying pink flamingos and putting them in their front lawn, but selling pink flamingos isn't a scam. Like, it's ridiculous. So
this is an interesting question, though. So finish your thought.
And kind of in its entirety, that's trying to get back to my point. So the early Bitcoiners, because that's like truly what Bitcoin was, instead of this new kind of like moralistic version, we often said that these other blockchains are test nets for Bitcoin, that people weren't that anti-alt. We were just like, cool, it's kind of dumb, but yeah, sure, go buy your Dogecoin. Like I was friends with Jackson Palmer, the guy who invented Dogecoin in San Francisco. Like we didn't consider him to be like evil or morally corrupt. Is more of like, yeah, that's retarded. But
It's just like fucking around with
yeah,
technology,
exactly.
like have some fun.
Right. And so, I believe Litecoin tested out SegWit. Litecoin tested SegWit first before we implemented it over on Bitcoin. So the idea that these other chains can experiment and we'd bring back those innovations and that technology back to Bitcoin, that was a core narrative of the Bitcoin maxi narrative in the, I would say, like 2015 through 2020 era. Like that was a core tenet of like, cool, we'll see what happens there. Whatever works, we're going to bring back. And so DeFi saw clear protocol market fit over on Ethereum. And so us as the moderates and as the Bitcoin DeFi folks bringing that back to Bitcoin is actually 100% aligned with what Bitcoiners used to be. It's only this recent maxi cohort of kind of Puritans who have moralized everything where they find issue with it.
So, go ahead.
I also want to say, like, I think a lot of people view Bitcoin as a static, I would say layer or a static blockchain, but
Pat Rock.
but the reality is like Bitcoin has been changing, and I would say like the core devs aren't necessarily opposed to changing. It's just the change has to be very responsible, and I think if things start to work on other chains that then compromise the value and the ethos of what Bitcoin really is, I think there's enough people that care about Bitcoin to make some of those changes to enable us to build things like rollups on top of Bitcoin, and OpsZKP or OpCat, are certainly like some of those ways where if we don't think about these things right now, then maybe Bitcoin starts to continue to be pet rock, which I think the consensus is that they just care about the value of Bitcoin being sustainable, but it doesn't have to be pet rock.
Yeah, I mean, it's all intertwined, but there was in the last hard fork, with the Bitcoin Cash hard fork and the whole civil war that ensued from that, the core scaling debate was sort of solved in the Bitcoin world based on saying like we're going to scale in layers. That's what was sort of agreed upon in the social
During
consensus.
block size wars, basically. It's like, okay, we're going to go to 4 megabytes and we're going to do layers.
Exactly. That's what we all agreed on. But our layers don't have really strong, trust minimized ties to the L1. It's like sidechains, which are, threshold model, basically multi-sigs, which I don't think game theoretically is what people want long term.
No.
If these sidechains have $1 trillion in value, I'd prefer them to have better game theoretic connectivity to the Bitcoin base layer. And so the Puritan maxis haven't resolved this, where then we say, okay, cool. Like, yes, we also as Bitcoiners agree we should scale in layers. So we should have things like OPCat, or we should have some sort of upgrade to the protocol, which OPCat's not even an upgrade. It was in Bitcoin originally, and Satoshi took it out. So like technically you're just like reverting back to an older state of Bitcoin. But, if we don't create really strong ties from Bitcoin L1 to the L2s, then I think we've sort of violated this social contract that we all agreed on, which is that Bitcoin's going to scale in layers. But if we don't do that in a responsible manner, then we're building pretty shaky infrastructure. And this doesn't change what Bitcoin's about. I mean, OpCat's only like 9 lines of code. This is very basic sort of stuff. This isn't like we're changing the proof of work, the supply. We're introducing a really crazy amount of like new complex code. I mean, you've got folks over at Blockstream that are totally on board with OPCat, which are very conservative core devs.
Well, I was going to say, my understanding is that, even amongst, Bitcoin Maxi devs, support for, if not OpCat, some kind of covenant is sort of widely accepted at this point. Right, I mean, there seems like a strong likelihood this will happen.
Totally. But these moralistic Puritans have heard this sort of, this clanging bell from these influencers that push that moralistic kind of perspective forward, where they're like, any change to Bitcoin is a violation of Bitcoin, of Bitcoin's core, which means they don't have any technical sort of understanding of Bitcoin at all. They're being told that if Bitcoin changes, that hurts the value of Bitcoin, which is not true.
Nervous, right? I mean, I hear it often described as like open heart surgery, right? Like risky business, which maybe has some validity, but I think it was Jameson Lopp who said not doing it also has consequences, right?
Jameson's, I think, one of the best clear-headed voices in this space. He's phenomenal. one of the few OGs left, you know.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, he said this, and it kind of got me thinking, okay, what are the consequences of not implementing a covenant of some kind? And I mean, realistically, that just means everyone's using custodial Bitcoin. I mean, that is the long-term
as
reality.
Transaction fees rise, it crowds out who can. No, not everyone can transact on the base layer. Like, we all knew that.
Yeah.
However, then, well, how do we support the maximum amount of people transacting on the base layer? How do we ensure that L2s are really secure? So if someone can only transact on an L2 ever because transaction fees in L1 are so high that they're transacting in an extremely trust minimized way, to where like Bitcoin L2 is almost like Bitcoin L1 for them. These are unresolved, and I think the Puritans are just like, oh, well, yeah, like, cool, so the fees are going to rise, and we're just not going to do anything about that. And I'm like, yes, we can't control fees rising because we're not going to increase the block size, but what we can control is like how people access the Bitcoin base layer and how they access L2s.
So while we're on the maxi, you brought it up, Dan, so I'm just going to lean in. While we're on this like maxi conversation, so just to kind of play a little devil's advocate, I think there's a lot of maxis out there whose sort of position is not necessarily, a moralistic one in the sense of like, oh, the tech just can't change for some unknown reason, but maybe they have a problem with just shitcoinery in the sense of like, the poor retail bebes who are like coming in and being shilled these shit coins and like not really learning about Bitcoin and
Right.
the reality of Bitcoin. And, that's the problem, right? Is that we should be hammering the mic on actual Bitcoin. This is the safe asset, what people should be holding, and, encouraging somebody who doesn't own Bitcoin to buy a monkey picture. That's where the ethical qualms come into play. What's your response to that?
Well, if they also want to opine about someone buying pink flamingos, then they can moralize every single transaction in the world. A JPEG isn't trying to compete with bean money. It's a very distinctively separate type of asset. That's like being like, well, should you buy your groceries, or should you buy a piece of art, or should you invest in the S&P? And it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, it's to each their own. I'm not going to go tell someone that a piece of art is equivalent to the S&P. It's not. I'm also going to tell someone a consumption good is equivalent to an investment. Right. So it's very subjective. And so that's where I think I agree with their considerations around competing monies. Naturally, in a competitive environment, we want Bitcoin to win. So having someone get distracted by Litecoin or Dogecoin is silly and a waste of time. Right. So, I thought altcoins would have died down by now, but they've never been bigger, really, like in terms of like how many are created. And I think just they're always going to exist, and they're each going to like go trend to zero against Bitcoin over time, but you can't really stop them. If we want to talk about what activities on Bitcoin are legitimate versus non, because that's the argument that they're making. I mean, early Bitcoin transactions are purely gambling and drugs. Like that's it.
Gambling is the oldest, most like one of the most important pastimes of all. Ever, right?
I played Satoshi Dice.
Right.
Not a lot, but it was fun.
We've been gambling since like the cavemen days,
Yeah,
right?
gambling is just what humans are.
Right.
It's sort of like it's what they want humans to be versus what humans are. And so speculation and drugs were the first activities on Bitcoin. Like if you look at transactions on Bitcoin, a majority of them were from gambling and Silk Road.
Right. It has product market fit, you guys.
Yeah, it has product market fit. And then, transition from that into, you have like people using it for scams and everything like that, which I don't like those activities, but I'm not going to go say someone shouldn't be able to do that. It just is what it is. It's a neutral platform. And then you look at like Counterparty. Counterparty had tokens on Bitcoin back in 2015, 2014. And most Bitcoiners were okay with it at the time.
It's funny how that changes.
Tether was originally issued on Bitcoin using Omni.
I remember.
Yeah, so, Tether.
Or someone told me. I wasn't there, but I heard.
Tether, it's the worst shitcoin of all, right? It's fiat, right? So, fiat was all up on Bitcoin's blockchain. So the idea that like this Bitcoin blockchain is pure, and if it's not like a coffee payment to some fucking Bolivian who's trying to like sell you coffee, that's like not according to Bitcoin's core ethos or Satoshi's ideology, is just ridiculous. Like the Bitcoin block space has been used for all sorts of transaction types.
From an investment perspective, from the asymmetric side, do you guys have a preference in terms of, investing in applications, businesses, et cetera, that gear more towards speculation versus maybe some of these kind of like more hard traditional lending type use cases? Do you have a point of view from an investment perspective?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the fund has a pretty, 3 or 4 pillar type mandate where it's, dApps, meta protocols, L2s, and staking.
Staking. Yeah.
So I think, it's just, it really centers around the concepts that have, viable product market fit over a long run. I wouldn't say that it requires, a huge amount of speculative activity per se, but it certainly doesn't hurt. I think speculative activity really brings users to the table, and then users bring the value.
In speculation, I think I looked into the kind of history of early asset types for fun, like at the origin of equity and debt, the origins of options, etc.
Yeah.
With each, equities were actually quite controversial when they came out, because debt had really been one of the only instruments out there. And when the merchant class sort of emerged in like medieval England, like medieval Europe, people put together these entities for like voyages for boats, right? So you would speculate, you would all pool your money together and fund this boat trip to India to get spices and come back. Very risky. Some of the boats never came back.
That's like the earliest. Is that like the history of equities?
So yeah, that's like the history of like early entity formation was around ships.
Wow.
So you had things like the East Indies. The East Indies company was one of the largest companies ever to exist. They, I think, at their peak was 1/3 of global GDP.
Wow.
Because they controlled all of India and everything else. But the fervor around some of these equities were so high that that England banned new equities from being issued for 100 years.
Wow. Because people, what was
the speculative bubble around the East Indies company was so large. Isaac Newton famously lost money in that.
People were getting rugged, basically. People were losing lots of money.
It wasn't even
and
rugged.
It was scary.
It was a legitimate company.
Right.
But just like, what's this company worth? The speculation was so enormous that people just did that.
People lost money.
Yeah, there wasn't a royal charter issued for a new equity formation for like 100 years. So like equities themselves were controversial. Options didn't exist in the US, I think, until the 1970s.
Yeah. And so, I mean, speculation in general has always been controversial, right? I mean, it's like gambling is moralized, period. Right.
Yeah, gambling, speculation. What's the difference between someone day trading spot equities or throwing dice on a table? I mean, granted, long term, one probably is going to pan out versus another, but we're not talking about investing, which is like buying and holding.
Right.
That's like a different sort of activity. So new financial instruments like PUPS, I think, were PUPS invented in crypto? I forget.
Yeah, perps were invented in crypto.
Arthur Hayes?
By Arthur Hayes, actually. So
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like a new financial instrument. There's all sorts of other ones you can carve out that I think that experimentation is really interesting to see. And speculation is inherent with humans. We don't shy away from it. Granted, I think there is something real, of course, in what we're investing in. But speculation is what drove Bitcoin adoption, and certainly doesn't hurt DeFi activity.
So when did you guys make your first asymmetric investment together?
That's a good question.
Oh, yeah. What was our first one together? What did you join? Was it July?
I joined in August.
Yeah.
It actually may have been Arch.
I think it was Arch. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good one.
Yeah. Yeah. We're really big fans of Matt, and you're very close to Matt.
He's incredibly impressive. I mean, just like, I mean, I've had him on camera a couple times and he just absolutely crushes every single time. Yeah.
All of our founders, I mean, what we look for in them, I spent 10 years in Silicon Valley. I've created and sold 2 companies. First one I sold to blockchain.com. Second one I sold to Kraken. What we look for in founders is someone fucking relentless.
Yes, he's relentless.
That is relentless.
Totally.
Charlie from BitLayer, relentless. Alexi from Bob, relentless.
Relentless also.
These are, to be a founder, I mean, you're going to have to pound your head against a brick wall until it turns into dust to get stuff done. And we invest for the long haul. We're a VC fund. I mean, we don't mind if this takes a cycle or two. Like
What's your lockup, if you don't mind me asking?
It's 7 to 10 years.
Okay.
It's a classic closed-end.
So this is a multi-cycle play.
Yeah, we are very patient with our thesis. I think we'll see some glimmers of that play out this cycle, but we are still deploying. We only have deployed 1/3 of the fund, so we still have 2/3 to deploy over the next. Typically, you deploy about over 3 years.
Last and final question: do you think that the cycle thesis will continue as it has in the past?
I think my view is, as Bitcoin becomes de-risked and more accessible, the volatility inherently decreases. And, I think if we just look at the perception of Bitcoin in 2021 and 2022 and even 2023 was deemed as a pretty risky asset. And even prior to that, it's like, oh, well, there was just so many people calling it to go to zero. But now we have ETFs, we have institutional adoption, you have the potential SPR. So people are really taking it seriously. And I think as a byproduct of that, we're probably unlikely to have the, crazy swings, related to Bitcoin itself, because there's a buyer now sitting at 70K or 60K, and it's so much more accessible. So yeah, I think cycles will always happen. If we look at the equity markets, there is still a macro cycle just by default. And I think the global macro cycle will play its course on Bitcoin as an asset. But I think because it's much more understood and much more accessible, the swings on the upward side and on the downward side will become muted. Just to put it into context, like I don't think this cycle is necessarily over. I think we're definitely in a point where people are a little bit nervous on the global economy because of tariffs and unpredictability. And when I guess institutional investors can't price revenues or earnings far out enough, well, then they're a little bit more short-sighted and less risk on. And I think that's really what's been happening as of late.
I mean, Bitcoin's final form is going to be like a gold 2.0 with DeFi on it, but like gold is fucking boring. Like it's, our kids and grandkids are going to be like, Dad, Mom, Bitcoin? Yeah, cool. Like if I'm like paranoid about the, about the markets, I'll buy Bitcoin, kind of like how we view buying gold. Now, granted, Bitcoin's market capitalization at that point will maybe be like 50 to 100 trillion or something, right?
Way more than gold. Yeah.
Yeah, and much higher value from here. So Bitcoin's final form is a risk-off asset, right? It doesn't have any sort of native yield. Holding it is something it's called like, essentially your safe haven asset.
Right.
So eventually Bitcoin will be inverted with market cycles. So right now it trades as a risk-on asset. Eventually it'll trade inversely to the market where like people are panicking, they buy Bitcoin, Bitcoin's value goes up. Equities are booming. People probably sell off Bitcoin to invest in equities because equities have a higher rate of return. That's Bitcoin's final form, is I consider kind of a dampener of the market cycles, where we finally go back to a sound money standard, where cycles are dictated by basically this fixed number of supply, as to where there's no more printing and no government influences cycles as much anymore, where Bitcoin itself is just kind of naturally equilibrates the cycles. That world is decades away, and
right.
we are in the price discovery phase of how much value that's going to be. So I still think we'll see volatility. I mean, I agree it's becoming less and less volatility, but Bitcoin should be worth in the millions if it truly is gold 2.0. So we're quite far away from that. I still think we have a lot left in the cycle. I think there's a big narrative that a lot of people are saying that like Bitcoin's volatility is going to be permanently diminished. If you look at IV, which is implied volatility, you do see implied volatility dropping quite a bit, where basically the traders are pricing in future volatility to be low. I mean, 21 million having a fixed number of supply of Bitcoin, that's not conducive for stability of price, right? So I do think we see volatility drop relative to other cycles, but I still think Bitcoin will be pretty volatile until we reach that final gold 2.0 era.
And I think there's still like a risk element to Bitcoin. You have things like the big question mark on, is this going to become, an active ecosystem or a fundamental pillar of blockchains that build on top of it. And, the quantum risk, for example, is something that I think is still, maybe an overhang. And I think once we get past these risk points, I think we do see a significant difference to what Bitcoin price is today and, maybe after those points. But like you said, it's trending in that direction to be sound money and something that trades against macro cycles.
I love that you dropped the quantum risk in there. We got to get BIP 360. We got to get people talking about BIP 360, get those quantum resistant address types into Bitcoin. So thank you for mentioning that. My personal favorite pet mission. Thank you guys so much. This was so fun. Like really a treat to have you both. Any like final thoughts about like what you see happening in the short term? I was going to ask you, this was going to be like my last question was like, do you think that the halvings are going to play a role in cycles going forward, or is that like over now?
Well, look, so if you go back to efficient market hypothesis, people talk about, well, the price of an asset reflects everyone's perception of what it's worth. So all information in the market is priced in. That is accurate. It's not predictive of future price. It's descriptive of the current perception. So how many people are paying attention to Bitcoin? Not very many. So I think Bitcoin, like from a, the halvings as well are known, but how many people are paying enough attention to really care?
So true.
Like Bitcoin's code hasn't changed that much since I got into it in 2011. The only thing that changed is that other people read the white paper, they read Satoshi's writings, they played around with it, and they're like, oh, this is pretty huge. Yeah, so I mean, simply just perception of it, of more people paying attention. I don't think that things like the halving are really priced in, is what I'm trying to say.
Interesting. Hot take. Oh my gosh. Again, thank you so much, guys. This was super, super fun. Where can folks learn more about you guys? I mean, I'm sure everyone who's watching this probably knows both of you, but
I guess for me, it's mostly on Twitter.
Twitter.
Yeah, FarmerJoe 0x.
And then Dan Held on Twitter. And of course, asymmetric.financial.
Does asymmetric.financial. That was going to be my next
We were
question.
a little bit stealthy for a while. The website was just like an intake form.
Oh.
And then now we actually have our port goes up of the VC venture fund, the classic crypto venture fund that came before our fund.
Okay.
Our fund. And so, yeah, you go see our portcos on there. We've made 9 investments so far.
Yep.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks as well.